Okay. The study really challenged us to move beyond what we have seen in the prior storms or disasters, even the most severe. We had to critically examine the nation's preparedness for a catastrophic, widespread power outage, one that is beyond anything that we have experienced in terms of severity, scale, duration, and consequence. And we found that the status quo of existing frameworks and processes is not enough to prepare for and respond to these events. That is not to diminish the important work that is being done in many fronts. There has been continuous improvement in our disaster response processes and frameworks, especially following the severe natural disasters experienced in the past decade. We also learned of a number of ongoing efforts by industry and government, Chris mentioned some of them, that are important and should continue to be advanced and supported. When we last met in June, we shared with you the results of the scoping effort that helped narrow the focus for this current study. Since we were unable to meet as planned in September due to Florence, we want to quickly review some necessary background. First, we will provide a quick overview of the scoping effort, followed by our tasking from the National Security Council and how we approach this study, including what we mean when we talk in this study about catastrophic power outages. Second, we would like to spend the bulk of our time today discussing the recommendations for approval by the full council. The information we present today is at a high level, and additional detail can be found in the report. You'll also see references to the page numbers at the bottom of each slide where detailed information can be found in the report. The loss of power in the electric grid is a common study topic, as power seems to be acknowledged as the most critical of the critical infrastructures. Thus, the NSC tasked us in November of 2017 to first define a narrower scope for the actual study of how to improve the nation's capacity to survive a catastrophic, long-duration power outage. An initial working group, chaired at that time by Ben Folk and Jan Allman, conducted interviews with 21 senior leaders and experts and reviewed more than 350 sources. They narrowed the topic down to 8 key areas of inquiry for in-depth examination. The hard work of the 6 NIAC members who made up the working group for the scoping effort provided the foundation for this study, and they're identified in the appendix to the report. We learned in the scoping effort that significant progress has been made in emergency response and recovery planning in recent years. However, our nation's critical infrastructure and services are growing more interconnected and interdependent, which creates severe response and recovery challenges during a catastrophic power outage. An event of this unprecedented but totally possible requires a new approach. The NSC tasked us in May to build on our work from the scoping effort and develop findings and actionable recommendations on how the public and private sectors can work together to mitigate the risks posed by catastrophic power outages. I won't read through the entire tasking, but I do want to highlight the 5 issues the NSC asked us to address. Approaches to increase resilience and reliability to infrastructure systems, including through investments. The factors needed to maintain national and economic security and critical lifeline operations while restoring power. The ability to prioritize and coordinate resource sharing across federal, state, and local entities and the private sector. The current understanding of critical infrastructure interdependencies and how FEMA's power outage incident annex fits within current public-private preparedness activities. To complete this study, the NIAC formed a working group of 10 members, many of whom also participated in the scoping effort to give us continuity during the study itself. And I want to thank the working group members who I named earlier. The scoping effort provided us with a framework, but we knew we needed to vet and validate those ideas. To do this, we formed a study group of 13 subject matter experts from many different sectors, and a full list is included in the backup slides. And several of those members are here in the room today as well. The study group gathered an enormous amount of information through research and panel discussions with dozens of experts. The work of the study group was a key input for the working group to help us develop our recommendations and supporting findings. And I will mention that the study group really was at the operational level. It consisted of people who are really in the trenches working these issues day in, day out, and we felt that that would be a good way to vet many of the initial findings of the scoping group. While the study group conducted its work, the working group pursued its own information gathering through research and interviews with senior leaders in government and experts in infrastructure, security, and resilience. Between the scoping effort, the study group, and the working group, we interviewed 65 experts in government, industry, at NGOs, in academia, and reviewed more than 700 sources. Based on all of the insights and information gathered, we found that while the nation has steadily improved its ability to respond to major disasters, existing plans and strategies would fall short during a catastrophic power outage. And so what did we mean when we said catastrophic power outage? There are a number of terms used by federal agencies and in the emergency management space to describe severe, long-lasting disasters, and we are not replacing those definitions. I won't read through all of these, but we did feel like we needed to define what we thought the NSC was asking us to study to make sure that we didn't cross over into other efforts that were ongoing. And so defining it helped us frame the study and provide the context. So for our purpose and our purpose today, catastrophic power outages are events beyond modern experience that exhaust or exceed the mutual aid capabilities, as I mentioned earlier. There are robust emergency response plans and mutual programs, but during an event of this scale, utilities and states are unlikely to have surplus supplies or workforce, and depending on the severity of the event, it may be impossible to bring help in from unaffected areas of the country. It is also likely to be an event that occurs with limited or no notice and potentially includes both man-made and natural threats. Events of this scale could include a sophisticated cyber-physical attack timed with a major natural disaster, repeated events in a short period of time that cause significant physical damage, or even electromagnetic events, whether natural or man-made, that could cause severe damage. This is an important distinction because while we did not focus on cause, we want to make clear we are not just talking about a bigger, stronger storm. Long duration, lasting at least 2 months, but more likely 6 months or longer. You mentioned Puerto Rico, could go for a year or more. This would be due to physical destruction to equipment, severity of the event limiting the available workforce, or inability to create or transport the replacement parts needed. Affects multiple states or regions, impacting between 50 to 75 million people and threatening state and or regional economies. Causes severe cascading impacts across critical sectors as the outage persists and backup generators run out of fuel, break down, or become insufficient. In short, the NIAC was asked to examine the nation's ability to withstand a catastrophic power outage of a magnitude beyond modern experience, exceeding prior events in severity, scale, duration, and consequence. The complexity of this challenge requires working across agencies, all levels of government, and critical infrastructure sectors. Our recommendations seek to address this problem in 2 ways. First, we believe we need a national approach to prepare for, respond to, and recover from catastrophic power outages that provides the federal guidance, resources, and incentives to take action across all levels of government and industry down to the community and individual level. Federal leadership to achieve this is crucial. Current planning frameworks focus on sector-by-sector preparedness and response, but during an event of this scale, infrastructure and services will fail as a system. We need to take a systems approach from the federal level down to the local level to plan, design, and respond to these never-before experienced events. Second, we need to improve our understanding of how cascading failures across critical infrastructures will affect restoration and survival during catastrophic power outages. This involves identifying the cascading failures that will impact key sectors, especially for power, natural gas, and communications that have a critically important role in restoring power and maintaining lifeline sector operations. We developed specific recommendations under these two categories. We have also identified a cabinet-level secretary to lead the implementation of each recommendation, along with a primary supporting agency or agencies and other agencies that will provide key insights and expertise. And I will say that this is the first NIAC study that I've been involved in where actually we have also focused on the capabilities that DoD can bring to the table this time around. Implementing the recommendations will require federal leadership and substantial coordination, not just among agencies, but also across state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, and across all critical infrastructure sectors. Finally, through the course of the study, we learned about a number of ongoing initiatives in the public and private sector that are in line with our recommendations and should be supported and advanced. In the interest of time, the recommendations will only be summarized today, but our report provides more details on the action needed and the findings that create the basis for the recommendations. Our first recommendation is around the federal authorities. An event of this scale, with severe economic and national security implications, will require an unprecedented level of federal leadership. We found that existing frameworks do not identify who has the ultimate decision-making authority or clearly identify the roles and responsibilities for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments or the private sector during a widespread, multi-state, catastrophic power outage. It will likely engage the military and cause the federal government to exercise authorities that have rarely or never been used. While this is understood conceptually, it remains unclear how authorities would change, who would make decisions, and how resources would be coordinated. A first step to examine and clarify the authorities that may be exercised during catastrophic power outages. Specifically, we believe an examination of federal emergency authorities is needed to identify how these authorities could be activated, by whom, and what the implications are for the private sector, state and local responders, and ultimately how these authorities might support presidential action. As part of this process, cabinet-level officials need to be identified to lead, and there must be established processes for how they engage with the public and private sector and with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments to manage the impacts which will cascade across critical infrastructure. We understand that mission, budget, and authority are central to a federal agency's ability to take action. We recommend that catastrophic power outages be included as a high priority mission not only for the Department of Energy and the Department of Homeland Security, but also the Department of Defense and key offices and agencies within them. Finally, private sector expertise will be crucial for identifying issues and to respond more quickly to what will likely be no notice or limited notice events. We recommend enhancing critical infrastructure participation at the National Infrastructure Coordinating Center and the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Sector, the NIC and the NCIC. We recommend that private sector representatives be on site full-time to better understand center operations and provide industry perspective and insights. At a minimum, the electric, financial services, and communications sectors are currently structured to easily identify appropriate representatives from the sector coordinating councils or information sharing and analysis centers to be on site. But these cannot be the only sector representatives. Other critical lifeline sectors, such as oil and natural gas, water and wastewater systems, and transportation systems, need to work with DHS to determine the appropriate representatives and level of engagement at the NIC and the NCIC. Given the cross-sector requirements of this recommendation, we believe that the Secretary of Homeland Security is best positioned to lead, but DOE and DOD will have important roles in supporting this effort. Finally, there are two ongoing initiatives that align with this recommendation. FEMA is currently updating the National Response Framework and adding a cross-sector emergency support function, and DOE is working to outline how grid security emergency orders are handled. These initiatives should be continued and supported. And now for our next recommendation, I'll turn this over to Ben Folk, who co-chaired the scoping effort. Ben?
Thank you, Connie, and thanks for the presentation. Building infrastructure and community resilience for this type of catastrophic event is challenging because there's no common understanding of what we need to be prepared to withstand. Yeah, I had it on. Is it back on? Okay. Keep me posted. And potential consequences that we must mitigate. There's no common agreement on the level of redundancy or resilience that is needed for electric systems. There's also no common understanding of how long other sectors, water and wastewater treatments, hospitals, and communication service providers are prepared to go without power, communications, or other critical services. Federal design basis and design standards and criteria can guide planning and mitigation efforts, serve as a basis to develop appropriate incentives and investments, and provide the framework needed for investments to be made over time. The design basis should take into account the cross-sector implications and cascading service failures of a catastrophic power outage. We also need to better understand the financial implications of a catastrophic power outage and how economic risks need to be factored in. We recommend an assessment of the economic and socioeconomic impacts of these events. The analysis should also examine and identify any barriers to federal financial support services for tribal and territorial governments to ensure that they have access to resources given the economic and geographic limitations some face. There are two ongoing initiatives that we believe the federal design basis could be integrated into or supported by. The National Institute of Standards and Technology Community Resilience Program provides tools, guidance, and resources to assess resilience and support informed decision-making. We would recommend that the federal design basis criteria be integrated into this program's efforts. The newly formed National Risk Management Center is in the process of identifying national critical functions, and we recommend that the results of this analysis and the center's analytical capabilities be shared with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments and owners and operators to help inform decision makers as they identify state and community level critical functions that must be prioritized for restoration and hardening investments. The implementation of this recommendation is going to involve a number of agencies, but should be led by the Secretary of Homeland Security, with DOE providing the primary support role. Other agencies that will have crucial roles include the NRMC, the NIST Community Resilience Program, and the Council of Economic Advisors. So Bev Scott will be presenting our next recommendation. Bev?
Ben, thank you very much. I'm going to speak to the recommendation regarding community enclaves. While the NIAC focuses specifically on infrastructure, this study has made us very keenly aware that resilient communities and the American people are the cornerstone of infrastructure recovery. The reality is that any event that requires a mass evacuation of people will use up critical resources, likely overwhelm transportation pathways, and seriously impact the available workforce for recovery. It is also quite likely that a catastrophic power outage affecting tens of millions of people may mean that evacuation is impossible. And if an event stretches into weeks or months, many will want or need to return to their homes. The practical reality of all of this is that we need to place specific emphasis on helping to make it possible for people to shelter in place. This will require a massive cultural shift to build resilience at the individual and community level. But really, it is not anything that's that new for the American people. And I date myself, although, and it really is the next generation from what Mark was talking about earlier, because back when I grew up in inner city Cleveland, Ohio, we had National Prepared. My mama was down there changing water and tuna fish cans and all of that. And that was the hunker down, okay? But now we go into the next generation, which is the bounce back, okay? And that's really, so the American people have done this, okay? And so we're really talking about that massive cultural shift. It will also require the federal government to provide the guidance and the resources needed to accomplish this. We recommend that the federal government, led by the Secretary of Homeland Security, develop guidance and provide resources for states, territories, cities, and localities to design and create community enclaves. These community enclaves are not new mass shelters or camps. They would leverage existing facilities and the supporting infrastructure they need. The enclaves would be strategically located across communities to support public health and safety by co-locating critical services and resources and allowing residents to be able to stay in their homes when that is possible. We are not talking about a race to build new structures, although that may be the answer in some instances. First, we suggest leveraging and building upon existing community structures. Schools, malls, could be an indoor stadium that can be upgraded using agreed upon resilience standards, fuel, power, communications, and creating local resilience centers quicker and at less cost than just running out building new ones, okay? That said, guidance and resources will be needed to establish these enclaves, starting with identifying the critical lifeline functions that must be provided, supported, and for how long: electricity, fuel, clean drinking water, wastewater services, food, refrigeration, emergency medical services, communications capabilities, and some access to financial services have been identified by all the folks that we have been just pleasure to talk with, are just some of the critical lifeline services that would be needed to sustain local communities and prevent the necessity for mass migration. So while not a cookie cutter, this is really important work that will require that there are going to have to be some clear but very simple requirements. Demonstrations of different community enclave design approaches should be supported, and peer-reviewed results and lessons learned provided to utilities and communities. These demonstrations could range from hardening existing infrastructure to microgrids that combine distributed energy resources, energy storage, and innovative consumer technologies. Voluntary assessments of critical functions at the state, local, tribal, and territorial level are needed to help identify the existing infrastructure and the services that are needed to establish and support these community enclaves. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the success of this recommendation requires a massive cultural shift to make people, each of us, more self-reliant and thoughtful. We know that FEMA's 2018-2022 strategic plan includes the goal of building a culture of preparedness, and we believe this is absolutely crucial, and we want to support everything that FEMA is doing in terms of its efforts in this space. Once again, a little personal note. I have family all through the Gulf, Mobile, Louisiana, Texas, and we are blessed to have 6 elders, and they range from 84 to 94 years old, one to be 95. And that needs to start, and it does, with a personal family thing of what do we do? Ain't sister over here, this one over here, because you cannot have the expectation when something hits, okay? And those are just some of the kinds of things that just not rocket science, okay? That are some of the things that when we're talking about this, it needs to get, all of us have a responsibility. So here we believe again that the Secretary of Homeland Security is best positioned to lead implementation of this recommendation with primary support from FEMA Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. DOE and the NIST Community Resilience Program will also have very key roles in this implementation. And now I am going to turn it over to Terry Boston, who will review recommendation number 4.
If I can, and kind of using your earlier comment that we could jump in throughout, if that's okay. So this, as we were talking in June, we got the initial readout of the report. The community enclaves piece was probably one of the more innovative aspects of the report, and that still resonates. I did want to point out that Jeff Byard from FEMA has joined us. You do mention a few things in here, whether it's Administrator Long has really been hitting this community of preparedness over the last 2 years. Secretary Nielsen, persistence, resilience, the resilience agenda that we're kicking off. So I didn't want to make sure, Jeff, if you wanted to say anything.
Thanks, Director, and we'll see out some of the best seafood in the real Alabama, so I know it well. I don't know, we may have power issues with you. Not for a long time. Just gonna hold it up now. Hello? All right. No, just touch on a few things. I appreciate that, Director. I'm very happy to hear lifelines throughout the whole, recommendations. 2 points I would point out as I was interviewed, from the emergency management standpoint, and there'll be some talk about Emergency Support Function 14 in the NRF National Response Framework that we definitely partnered with CISA on, but power is everything in our business in emergency management. 90% of our problems can be solved rapidly with power restorations. I will point out several references to Puerto Rico and a long-term power outage there. I was down earlier this week. It was 85 degrees and sunny. I don't know why I didn't stay down the rest of the week, but it's apparent across all the critical sectors, and this is it is what it is, but the majority of the issues are lack of maintenance. So anything that we build, anything that we look at, I would ask that maintenance be on the forefront of what we do when we do that. Also, not too comforting, but we talk about preparedness, citizens' preparedness. We also use a phrase that, we are 4 meals away from anarchy in our country. So when you think about that, power is related to that. We are dependent on just-in-time services. We're dependent on supply chains. We're dependent on goods and services being shipped. We're dependent on, in essence, the economy, which takes power to drive that. So I think there's more to come on that when we talk about that. But I appreciate that, Director Krebs. Thank you.
Yeah, one last thing. ESF is a manifestation. So you have to talk twice, by the way. I'm just going to start shouting. ESF 14 is a direct manifestation of the lessons learned from Harvey, Irma, and Maria. We piloted this hurricane season. We'll include it in doctrine for the next hurricane season. But there are other things that we're continuing to learn through hurricane season, whether it was Florence or Michael. That was the first time I'd really seen close coordination between power and communications. We were making some jokes between DOE and DHS about some of the band names that we had created, heavy metal band names like Chainsaw Discipline. Any of you that were on those calls pulled together by the ESSCC, what can we do to ensure that we're not seeing siloed emergency response? Again, these are things that are captured here that will manifest in the subsequent implementations, but we are continuing to learn, continuing to implement, and it's good to see that some of that feedback is rolling into the report.
If I can just say something, because this is kind of one of my biggest hot buttons, is this right here, and I just want to add my 2 cents on it. Is that really around that cultural shift in education, and I think we got to start even in the school systems, starting young, right? what do people need to do in case of crisis, and really getting that public-private partnership involved when community crisis hit. And the more involvement we have around that, you know, and I go back to that bird flu, you know, that get community stimulation, preparedness, we cannot do enough around that. And the more we prepare early, and in case it never happens, it's great, but if it does happen, the communities are prepared. And the faster people are prepared, the faster they're more resilient, you know, and self-reliant, it helps us all get up and moving faster. So, and that's what we saw in Puerto Rico even, in that analysis, communities that were active and were more able to do that themselves versus waiting for help for someone to go help them. So I just really want to pound on that. We need to figure out how to get that education out there, because we do not do that at all today. And we really need to start that education process.
Am I on? Okay. I usually project so much that it's not. But the other thing is, when you talk about how do I feel as a person, as a public, in terms of confidence, when I feel that I'm engaged and I know what I'm doing, I mean, and I'm doing something other than just hunkering down, okay, then I'm on, okay? And so I think in terms of that, you know, you can't stop the, there's only so much you can do. Mother Nature's gonna do what Mother Nature's gonna do, whatever. But just that even attitudinally, okay, when you get people engaged and they're working on it, that's when you got it really going. So I just think some of that you can't necessarily quantify it all, but everybody knows what I'm talking about, and that's a good thing.
Just two very quick points on that, and I agree. This is a very important point, but it's not the number one. Is there's been a good emphasis by FEMA, especially this year, to say that the first responders, but not firefighters, police, search and rescue, et cetera, the first responders are neighbors that are coming to help. And then secondly, this does exist in certain places already, and kudos to Anchorage, Alaska. So 2 weeks ago, they had an earthquake, but that was informed by their 1960 earthquake. They created the building codes, they enforced them, they made hard decisions, they taught the people, they practiced this stuff. So I think I've seen the video of the school that was up there with the kids just instantly went over the desk, everything was good, nobody was panicked, it was fine. Teacher stuck their head up, said, all right, we're good to go, let's go on outside. And stuff was back up and running in hours and days, rather than weeks and months. So that's the model we want. And kudos to that, and let's replicate that as well.
To build on this, the Brits say they're 4 days, instead of 4 days, they're 3 days away from anarchy. Aussies have 10 days of food and water supply in every home, so there are lots of things we can learn international. But I'm talking today about the incentives that we need. Next slide, please. To Chris's point about bringing Brian on board, at the NERC board meetings, we would call this a low-frequency, high-impact event with scary consequences in terms of lifeline. To Mark's point in his opening, this is Puerto Rico with 50 million people in the dark, and the August 14, 2003 blackout had 60 million in the dark, but it was a 3-day event and not months in this regard. So think Puerto Rico, that scale and duration, but 50 to 60 million people in the dark. There are incentives that are needed to help the state, local, tribal, and territorial governments and the utilities in terms of cost recovery to make the investments that are needed to prepare for this kind of extreme event. The national design basis that we've talked about, Connie talked about, could be the yardstick that we measure against to see what investment funds are necessary. Not all investments are in financial terms. We have worked quite a bit in public-private partnerships to increase the number of drills that we've done, including non-governmental organizations. Those things are high impact, relatively low cost to put into place. Our recommendation includes incentives that we believe are particularly important to the electric sector and others to helpfully collaborate between the sectors at all levels of government as well. Cost recovery is a big deal in our business. So we will talk some about how to do that. Tax credits are another incentive that have worked well in terms of the government setting direction. Mitigation funding, we actually approved $3.2 billion after Superstorm Sandy within a few weeks. Wouldn't it have been nice if we had hardened the grid before Superstorm Sandy? So mitigation funding, matching grants where hardening takes place, and I don't disagree. I'm on the TAC committee for Puerto Rico. Obviously, maintenance and design criteria makes a whole lot of difference. Another area is engaging the insurance industry in this and discuss potential rate structures that value the investment. I was surprised. I met with Lloyd's of London, and they're willing to insure a geomagnetic storm. So we need to be thinking about how we can cover this with insurance. We believe the Secretary of Treasury should be the primary support for this this recommendation. Obviously, Pat, DOE, and other sector specific agencies should lead the effort as well. FERC has to be involved if we're going to take action and get investments that we need. Other federal agencies may play a very important role as well. I would like to kind of pause here and continue the discussion, especially from the work group members and the council, on things that we need to do before we move on to talk about cross-sector interdependencies. And we have seen water, communication, and power in every event I've worked is the important cross-sector interdependency. So.
Actually, there's a great bridge between the last recommendation and this recommendation. It just so happens it's the perfect day to be talking about it. The President signed an executive order yesterday relating to opportunity zones, which were created by the tax cut last year. We had a couple of very large events on this yesterday. So for those that don't know, there are about 8,000 specifically designated census tracts that are called opportunity zones. And the opportunity there is through an established fund, private sector capital that is invested in these zones for a variety of purposes can be tax deferred for a period of 5 years to 10 years. 10 years provides the maximum level of tax deferment here. And this is actually just being implemented. Treasury is just releasing some of the rules and regulations around this now. But when you look at a long-term, a 10-year type of investment, that is perfect for attracting infrastructure development and infrastructure investment. So whether it is within our power sector, or whether it's within some of those interdependent sectors, and crossing into these somewhat underserved communities that need to develop that culture of preparedness more so than we have today, this is a great opportunity. And it, again, leverages our non-governmental organizations. These funds are in the process of being created. There are a number of academic institutions that get to exercise their roots as anchors of their communities and helping to form these non-governmental organizations and identify the funds and identify these opportunities that exist within these zones. Some of these are places that really desperately need the levels of infrastructure investment today. So it's an opportunity for us to say, if we are going to make substantial investment in redeveloping some of these areas, let's make it more resilient ahead of time. Much to your point of, it'd be great if we didn't have to harden afterwards. This, and in the course of the next 10 years, is an opportunity to harden or make more resilient through other means ahead of time.
One of the things that you see in this recommendation is that portfolio of incentives because, Mark, as you mentioned earlier, the incentives for regulated industries might be different. It might be cost recovery, but then for competitive industries, it might be like you're talking about these tax breaks or opportunity zones. And so that's one of the things that I think we really discussed a lot, that the federal government really was going to have to look and work with each of the sector-specific agencies to see what's the right incentive for all of the different sectors to be able to play and come to the table. So thank you for that. That's a great move forward already. So let me stop before we move to sort of the second category of recommendations and just ask if there's any other questions about the first part. Bob, you look like you've got one there.
Yeah, when I think about incentives in insurance, we have answered the question of metrics to some degree, the ability to prove review, demonstrate, demonstrably, your ability to work. Did you all look and see anything in terms of metrics and compare our incentives to demonstration?
I can give you a example on the Florida Peninsula. You may know we have some hurricanes down that way, and you take Hurricane Hugo, it took 28 days to respond and recover. We changed the design criteria. The Public Service Commission and FERC allowed cost recovery of hardening the grid, and I think it was 7 days on the last hurricane and yes, we moved, as Connie said, 60,000 electrical workers into that area very quickly, but the bottom line is design criteria and hardening matters.
Here's something else that may be of value is if we go back and look over the last 5 years of how much money the government has spent in response to the disasters, and we think about an incentive program where if organizations were able to meet a particular standard, let's say as defined as far as leading practices, then maybe the government can do a review on that, give them a grade, kind of like the old blast zone, buffer zone type of incentive program. We could probably look at the numbers and almost somewhat self-justify the fact of the incentive program to help reduce the numbers of costs spent if organizations were able to get to a certain level.
Jeff, are you guys looking at the ROI on assistance?
The ROI on public assistance versus the mitigation grants up front.
We are several things that very interested in Rich, what you just said. I think there's a look into that, and then for the co-ops and others that are eligible after the fact under the Stafford Act, we're really pushing fixed cost estimate grants that we can get out quicker than traditional methods, which I think lines up very well with what the documentation and how the cooperatives can do that. So several things, but we would encourage and support any change. As you know, the FEMA grants, as most of ours are public sector, which limits us to a wide range of customers. I like what Director Krebs said, a customer-based organization and powers a lot of private as well. So, we would encourage and look into any recommendations that would allow us to help strengthen in anything we can do on the front end. I believe it's, $1 spent on the front end saves us $7 on the back end, so, and that's across the board. Director, I don't know if that answered your question specifically.